You know, when we think of the 1920s, our minds immediately go to the Roaring Twenties, right? Jazz, flappers, these huge, endless parties. But just beneath that glittering surface, it was actually a decade of deep, bitter conflict. So what if I told you that all of it, the creativity, the clashes, the entire identity of the decade, was sparked by one single number? Just one piece of data that literally changed everything. It all comes down to this number, which was kind of buried in the data from the 1920 US Census. And for the very first time in its history, America had crossed this monumental threshold. More than 50% of its people were now living in cities. That's right. For the first time ever, America had officially become an urban nation. And look, this wasn't just a statistic in a report. This was a fundamental rewiring of American life itself.
And this is the key to understanding the entire decade. You can really think of this single fact as the engine driving everything we associate with the 1920s. Every major cultural revolution and every single political battle over morality, identity, and, who gets to be an American, it all stems directly from this massive shift from the country to the city.
So, what did this new urban world actually look like? Well, first off, the city created a space for brand new opportunities and a new kind of freedom, especially for groups who had always been on the margins of traditional rural America. This city was like a magnet, right? It created this critical mass of people and opportunity all in one place. For women, it opened up a path to economic independence with new jobs. For immigrants, it was the beating heart of industrial growth. And for African Americans who were arriving in the Great Migration, cities became these powerful new centers of community and culture, a world away from the oppression of the Jim Crow South. Which, of course, brings us to the flapper, the short skirts, the jazz clubs, the bobbed hair. We see all that as just symbols of the era. But they weren't just for show. They were really the visible proof of a much deeper internal shift. For the first time, women were gaining real economic and personal control over their own lives. And all this new urban energy sparked an incredible explosion of art, as different groups began using their voice to define their own experience. So in Harlem, you have artists like Langston Hughes forging this powerful, unapologetic Black identity. At the same time, you've got writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald capturing the disillusionment that was hiding just beneath the city's glittering materialist surface. And then you have artists like Yang Ji exploring that really complex feeling of navigating two cultures inside the American city. But as we know, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And this explosion of new voices, new ideas, and new freedoms, it triggered a powerful, organized, and often vicious backlash from people who believed the America they knew was just slipping away. This backlash was really rooted in a profound fear that the country was being taken from them. For established white Protestant communities, the sheer diversity of the cities felt like a direct threat to their cultural dominance. This wasn't just about jobs. It was a deep anxiety that their entire way of life was eroding right before their eyes. And this fear was translated into law, and fast. The court started twisting logic to enforce a racial hierarchy. It's wild. In 1922, they used pseudoscience to argue a Japanese immigrant wasn't white, but then just a year later, they completely abandoned science and instead used so-called common sense to deny citizenship to an Indian immigrant. It all led up to the 1924 National Origins Act, which basically just slammed the door shut, drastically cutting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and effectively banning it from most of Asia. This whole drive for conformity was captured in this slogan, 100% Americanism, and it had tragic consequences. You just have to look at the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian immigrants, known anarchists executed for murder. The evidence against them was incredibly shaky, and for a lot of people it seemed pretty clear they were on trial not for something they did, but for who they were. So, the fight over immigration and identity. That was one major battleground. But the other was this epic culture war that pitted the new ideas of modern science against the old-time beliefs of fundamentalist religion. And this whole conflict famously played out in the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. I mean, it was a true clash of titans. On one side, you had Clarence Darrow arguing for modernism, the idea that science and evolution weren't a threat to faith. And on the other, you had William Jennings Bryan, defending fundamentalism, a literal reading of the Bible that saw modernity as the enemy. It was a spectacle that put two completely opposite visions of America on trial for the whole world to see. So legally, John Scopes was found guilty of teaching evolution. But honestly, that wasn't the real story here.
In the court of public opinion, which was totally shaped by urban journalists who flocked to the trial, modernism won a huge victory. The fundamentalist view got painted as backward, rural, and completely out of touch.
But, and this is a big but, this embrace of science wasn't always a force for good. In fact, some scientific ideas were twisted to justify prejudice and some truly horrifying policies. And this is where the idea of science takes a really dark turn, into eugenics. It was this pseudoscience that claimed society could be improved by controlling human breeding. And what's so disturbing is that this wasn't some fringe idea. It became totally mainstream. It actually led to laws that allowed the state to forcibly sterilize people that it deemed unfit. And that brings us to one of the most chilling sentences ever written by the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1927, in the case of Buck v. Bell, the court upheld these sterilization laws. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the majority, declared, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It's just a terrifying moment where prejudice gets enshrined as the highest law of the land. Okay, so when you pull all of these threads together, the new freedoms, the fierce backlash, the battles over science and identity, you start to see the emergence of conflicts that would cast a very, very long shadow over the rest of the century, and frankly, right into our own time. I mean, if you boil it all down, you're left with the fundamental conflicts that define the decade, and in so many ways, still define America today: urban versus rural, science versus scripture, a modern, diverse vision of the country versus a traditional, homogeneous, nativist one. These are the battle lines. And let's be really clear about this. These were not side issues. This was the main event. This was a decade-long nationwide fight over the most fundamental question there is: what is America and what is it going to become? And this is maybe the most crucial point of all. These fault lines that were cracked open back in the 1920s, they never really yield. You can draw a straight line from the immigration quotas of 1924 to our debates about borders today. You can draw a line from the Scopes trial to modern battles over what's being taught in our schools. The divisions were drawn a century ago, but we are still living inside them. Which leaves us with one last big question. If modernism seemed to win the cultural battle of the 1920s, then why have the nativist and fundamentalist forces of that same decade proven to be so incredibly resilient? Why do the echoes of that backlash still resonate so powerfully today?